It's my honor to introduce an outstanding professor. And I need to ask a following set of questions. What would you say to the professor who teaches a class that attracts 1,000 students at the University of Virginia? What would you say to a professor that teaches an antitrust seminar with a 2-year waiting list? An expert witness who's testified in several precedent-setting antitrust cases. A professor who is also a mystery writer with a nom de plume or pen name of Marshall Javons. A visiting professor at Trinity and Pepperdine, a former visiting professor at Wheaton's International Study Program in Holland. Well, what you would say is, that must be Dr. Ken Elzinga. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Elzinga.
Good evening, everyone. If you've heard very many public lectures, you know how common it is in the United States for a speaker to say, "It's a pleasure to be here," or "I'm happy to be here," or "I'm honored to be here," or something like that. And usually that's a total fabrication. It's just not true. The speaker would rather be watching TV, reading a book, sitting on a beach. There's any number of things. But I actually am really pleased to be here. Wheaton College is a very special place to me, in part because in my own walk with Christ, Wheaton graduates have had a profound role in my life. As someone who has sensed a call to be a professor at a secular university, I'm very, very grateful that there are institutions of higher education in the United States that are Christ-centered. And also, as a graduate of a private liberal arts college that was started by Christians and is largely apostate now, I'm very grateful that Wheaton College remains for Christ and His kingdom. And I will just say to students here, what a responsibility you have as a baton is passed to you generation to generation to see that that stays true about your alma mater. So for a variety of reasons, it's a pleasure to be here. So, a man walks into a bar. There must be 10,000 jokes in the English language that begin with that opening line. Here's a variation, not a joke, but a true story. A young woman walks not into a bar, but into an econ professor's office. She's a student at the University of Virginia, and the office she walks into is mine. And we go through the basics of getting acquainted. I learned that her father owns a business that sells plumbing supplies, her mother's a homemaker, and she wants to talk to me about careers. Now, there's nothing unusual about this story so far. Professors of economics are magnets for students with questions about careers. The student tells me that she wants to have a career where she can, as she put it, help people. She asked me about some nonprofit organizations, and we talk about them. One of the several unplanned aspects of my life is that I serve on 6 boards, and 4 of them are in the nonprofit sector. So I can talk a lot about nonprofit organizations, but I also inquire about her going into the family business, the plumbing supply company that her father owns and operates. And she says no, she isn't interested in joining the family business. Rather, she wants a career where she can help people, as opposed to making money. Helping people and making money were seen by her as antithetical. It's as if an environmental activist pursued a career in logging redwood forests. So in my student's mind, she stood at a vocational fork in the road. One career path involved self-interest and the pursuit of money, where the operative words were, in her view, greed and self-interest. The other career path involved the nonprofit sector, where the operative words were public service and compassion. Now, years ago, at the University of Virginia, where I teach, there were a handful of students that could be seen wearing a plastic band with the letters WWJD. And that meant, what would Jesus do? Now, the founder of the discipline of economics is Adam Smith. So one might imagine a professor of economics wearing a wristband with the letters WWASD, as in, what would Adam Smith do? Now, Adam Smith's counsel to this young woman would be based upon something that's a mystery to many. And Smith called this mystery the invisible hand. And it's the metaphor of the invisible hand that is the peg on which I'm going to hang this talk. Now, there have been other authors besides Adam Smith who've used the term invisible hand. I suspect at Wheaton College, many of you know the writings of Flannery O'Connor. She used the term invisible hand in her novel Wise Blood. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the creature found his food supply replenished by an invisible hand. Nietzsche wrote that it was an invisible hand by which we're bent and tortured the most. But no one ever used the term invisible hand with the brilliance of Adam Smith. Smith claimed that by an invisible hand, social good could be accomplished when people pursue their own self-interest. Now, when I was much younger than I am now, I came across this anecdote from the writings of Frédéric Bastiat. And he was a French economist who wrote several decades after Adam Smith. And I'm going to read a quote, I'm going to read it very quickly, of what Bastiat wrote. This was back in 1850. On entering Paris, which I had come to visit, I said to myself, here are 1 million human beings who would all die in a short time if provision of every kind ceased to flow towards this great metropolis. Imagination is baffled when it tries to appreciate the vast multiplicity of commodities which must enter tomorrow in order to preserve the inhabitants from falling prey to famine, rebellion, and pillage. And yet all sleep at this moment, and their peaceful slumbers are not disturbed for a single instant by the prospect of such a frightful catastrophe. Now let's cut Bastiat some slack. He's writing about Paris after all. Perhaps not everyone was sound asleep during the night when Bastiat wrote those words, but what Bastiat wrote about Paris in 1850 is true for Paris in 2014, or for London, or Rome, or New York City, or Wheaton, Illinois. As I speak these words, there are thousands of goods being produced and transported to Wheaton, Illinois, and they will arrive here not because it's traditional that certain tribes or families send them here, not because some central authority has decreed that they're to show up here. They're brought here, to use Adam Smith's famous metaphor, as if by an invisible hand. And none of us who realize that, hey, our toothpaste supply is getting low, or we're low on orange juice, or we need a new pair of sweatpants or a suede jacket, we lose any sleep thinking that these items will not be on the store shelves tomorrow. The invisible hand will see to that. Now, the remarkable implication of the invisible hand is that the student who walked into my office might help people more, or help more people, if upon graduation she simply ran the family plumbing supply business at a profit, rather than doing something with the express purpose of helping other people. So here's how Adam Smith put it. Famous quote from Smith. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. So if you put that differently, we don't appeal to the good nature of those who make food and drink. We don't appeal to their sympathy. We don't appeal to their compassion. We don't even appeal to their desire to help other people in order to persuade them to put food and drink on our table. The mystery of the invisible hand is that we appeal to their self-interest, and in the process, we have food and drink. Now, Adam Smith is a great hero in economics, and here in the Midwest, where I was raised, I grew up in Michigan, the great hero is Abraham Lincoln. Living in rural Illinois, Lincoln was struck at the goods that came from other parts of the country and the world to what was then the Western frontier. Lincoln was struck that there were spices and whiskey and tobacco and glassware and sugar and tea and coffee, none of it produced in Illinois. And how'd these goods get to the land of Lincoln? Not because people elsewhere felt pity or compassion or benevolence or sympathy for the residents of Illinois. It was, in Smith's words, from their regard to their own self-interest. And it's this transformation of self-interest into the interest of others that occurs through what Adam Smith called an obvious and simple system of natural liberty. And one of the very few errors in Smith's masterpiece was he simply never anticipated that people would find economic analysis obvious or simple. So when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, and the year of publication was 1776, the experience of most people over the whole span of mankind's existence was one of grinding, hopeless poverty. Poverty with no relief, poverty with no expectation of improvement. So what Smith decided to do was explore and explain the aberrations. Why was it and how was it that some nations managed to escape this fate? And that was the explanation for the title of Smith's masterpiece. It was an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So we sometimes hear the question, what's in a name? What about the name Adam Smith? How fitting is that? Adam, the name of the first man, gets paired with Smith, the most common surname in the English language. The Bible tells us that God put a man named Adam in a garden that he might flourish. And that particular episode didn't go so well. We know that wealth became the province of royalty, potentates, religious and military leaders. Poverty was the plight of everyone else. But after countless generations of hardship, along came an Adam who wrote a book that tells us how even the Smiths of the world, the ordinary people, the little guys, might flourish, enjoying goods and services that leaders of old could never imagine consuming. Now let me put the rest of you on hold a moment and speak directly to econ students at Wheaton College. Okay? You may feel lonely at times. You think some of your professors and classmates just don't get it. They don't like markets, they don't like international trade, they associate Adam Smith and the invisible hand with the protection of wealth and privilege, with greed and selfishness, and you can't talk them out of it. Do you know why that is? The primary shortcoming of those who care about economic issues but don't understand Adam Smith is that they view the world as a zero-sum game. So in a zero-sum game, if there are 3 ice cream cones to be allocated, if this person gets 1 and this person gets 2 and that person gets the 3rd one, I don't get any. A lot of things in the world are zero-sum games. Chess, poker, when Mr. and Mrs. Jones argue who's going to drive the car to the grocery, those are zero-sum games. But in a market economy, if someone opens a Chinese restaurant here in Wheaton, Illinois, and prospers in doing so, a zero-sum game is not being played out. If someone invents a ballpoint pen, an automatic transmission, a cell phone, and they make money selling these products, a zero-sum game is not being played out. What economists call a positive-sum game is being played when people trade, when people innovate, when people exchange labor services for wages. Both sides of the transaction can be made better off. And it is the hidden economic logic of economics that makes this point. But the logic is hidden to many, even to those who want to do good, but can't imagine doing so while doing well. Parents tell us we can't have our cake and eat it too, but the principle of the invisible hand says we can. My student at UVA could return to her home city upon graduation and simultaneously make money and help people by selling PVC pipe, sinks, and toilets. The hidden economic logic of Adam Smith and of economic analysis ever since sets forth the conditions whereby one can do good by doing well in market exchange. Now let me come back and speak to the whole audience and raise this question. If the invisible hand is a mystery to so many, and if so many people don't get it, should the current generation of Wheaton College students be optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the economy? I want to answer that question. One of the curses of being an economist is that we usually end up being optimists and pessimists at the same time. Now, how can that be? Here's how. Economists are pessimists when we look forward. When we look ahead, we see politicians and corporations engage in rent-seeking and enacting rules and regulations that subvert the operation of the invisible hand. We see bankers in bed with government leaders distorting capital markets. We see the desire for more goods and services constrained by the production possibility frontier. We see no prospect around the corner for the end to the gut-wrenching poverty that affects so many people, particularly those who live outside of what Adam Smith called the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. So we wallow in pessimism looking forward. But then economists look backward, and we see the stunning increase in real per capita income that's been part of the West over the past 2 centuries, and now is affecting other parts of the globe. We see the technological changes that came out of Silicon Valley, connected with computerization and the internet. We realize that it's no longer the few that own most of the world's stocks and bonds, but the many. We see the rise of global markets and the enhanced competition that international trade brings to consumers. And we observe how those same markets are affording opportunities to entrepreneurs around the world, not just in Silicon Valley, but in Vietnam and India, and I hope soon in Africa and the Middle East. And looking backwards, we notice that almost all governments in the world now realize that communism is an empty economic promise. When I look backwards, I'm no longer gloomy about the future for my students. So let me come back to the student who walked not into a bar, but into an economist's office. The mystery of the invisible hand is that if this student were to sell PVC pipe, a toilet, and a sink to a homeowner who's adding a new bathroom to a house, she would be making money. But she also is making the homeowner better off. In other words, helping people. The hidden economic logic here is that if the student wants to make others better off, she should endeavor to make herself better off by engaging in mutually advantageous transactions. I want you to imagine with me a business firm that buys plumbing supplies from a manufacturer and shoulders the cost of holding these supplies in inventory, hoping against hope that some customer will want to purchase these products on terms that will sustain the continuing operation of the firm. And let me just raise a rhetorical question about this firm. How can it ever be an instrument of injustice or oppression? Now, to withhold the supply of plumbing equipment, that might be unjust, but to supply them to willing and informed buyers cannot be unjust. And that's why, in the case of voluntary exchange between an informed buyer and an informed seller, each party can say thank you when the transaction is consummated. That's what economists call gains from trade. Now, let me anticipate a question that many of you may have, and if you don't, you should. Did Adam Smith contend that a system of market allocation would always and invariably promote the public good? And here's the answer. No, he did not. Nor do economists make that contention today. Adam Smith's obvious and simple system of natural liberty is not the same as utopia. If there's one thing that solid training in the subject of economics will never do, is turn someone into a utopianist. A realist? Yep. A pessimist? Maybe. But a utopianist? Forget about it. In the great Greek philosophical divide, economists are Aristotelians, not Platonists. Economists are actually Calvinists, even if they don't know it. The subject of economics itself, indeed Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, wouldn't exist apart from the Reformation. Other professors may be drawn to Rousseau and the natural goodness of man, but economists are drawn to the fall of Adam and the expulsion from the garden. Prosperity is not the natural order of things. Poverty is. One of the most powerful principles of economic analysis is that pursuing one's self-interest can, as if by an invisible hand, bring about improved economic circumstances for others. And that claim is provocative, the idea is profound, but it is not utopianist. Millions have died at the hand of totalitarianism, not so by the invisible hand. Now, if the first portion of my talk was a celebration of the invisible hand, the concluding portion of my talk is a reminder of what the invisible hand is not. And I begin this part of the talk with another story of a student who walked into my office. She's a very talented young woman, formerly an econ major, a student in 2 of my classes. She now lives and works in her home country of India. And she had arranged to see me in my office in Charlottesville because she just had a book published on the new generation of entrepreneurs in India. And as would be the case with any professor, I was button-bursting proud that a student of mine would author a new book, and I looked forward to her visit. But in my office, the conversation took a turn that neither of us had expected. In the book, you see, she quoted favorably the poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley. Let me read a portion of it to you now. Most of you have heard this poem. You may not have remembered the Henley name. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. And this is the most famous part of Invictus. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Now, at first glance, one might think, here's a poem an econ student can enjoy. After all, the rational actor theory by which economists model behavior is the decision-making agent who seems to be the master of her fate. Rather than allowing herself to be molded by culture or social status or by the movement of the stars or by acts of God, she weighs the costs and the benefits of her actions, and she embarks on a utility-maximizing course of behavior. She alone is the captain of her ship. She alone is the molder of her soul. Whatever happens, the author of Invictus can claim she did it her way. Now, my beloved former student was surprised when I told her that what troubled me about her book was her use of the poem Invictus. I told her gently that I consider Invictus to be one of the most anti-Christian poems ever written. And I explained to her that I was drawn to this poem the same way that we are drawn to heresy. What makes heresy attractive and dangerous is there's usually an element of truth in it. But Invictus is heretical. Luther and Calvin would have disliked this poem very much. The hardy souls who began this institution would have disliked this poem very much. A foundation stone of the Christian faith is the sovereignty of God, not the sovereignty of the individual. So there's a singer named Frank Sinatra, and he had a theme song, My Way. And if you're in the audience and you have no idea who Frank Sinatra is, he once was as big as the Beatles. And if you don't know who the Beatles are, they once were as big as Beyoncé. So I invite you to think about the title of the Sinatra theme song. 2 words, My Way. And think about the 2 most famous words of Jesus. Follow me. What a contrast. Invictus claims, I'm the captain of my soul. The Apostle Paul comes along and describes himself as a slave or a servant of Jesus. Frank Sinatra sings, My Way. The Bible teaches, if I may impose some King James language on you, there is a way which seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Or as the NIV puts it, there is a way, note that word way, that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. The scriptures simply don't square with the poetics of Invictus. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. In his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord establishes his steps. This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but my spirit, says the Lord Almighty. So what's the problem with capitalism? Certainly not that it doesn't deliver the goods. It does. Certainly not that it requires greed. It doesn't. When G.K. Chesterton was asked what's wrong with the world, he said, I am. What's wrong with the market system is that it's populated with people like us, who come to believe that it is by our might and our power that things are accomplished. And here's the rub. Because the market system is such an extraordinary engine of abundance for so many, there are so many who can be deluded into thinking, I did this. I really am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul. Now, I've been told that I've taught more students at the University of Virginia than anyone in the history of the school, north of 45,000 students. And this is a bizarre data point for someone who loves the liberal arts and appreciates the small class sizes enjoyed by students at Wheaton College. I've also been teaching long enough to realize that many of my students hope that studying economics will help them make a lot of money. Sometimes I almost think I can see the aspiration written on their foreheads. You teach economics, so make me into a money machine. But does economics teach that money buys happiness? Is that what the discipline of Adam Smith ends up claiming? Not at all. What economics teaches is that having money, or as I might put it, having resources, expands your choice set. This means selfish people are better off with more money because they can buy more things. It also means that compassionate and generous people are better off having more money because they have more money to give away. Adam Smith described happiness not in economic or financial terms. He defined happiness as tranquility of mind. And he made it clear that neither money nor what it could command would bring happiness. I can still recall Smith's words when I first read them. Power and riches produce a few trifling conveniences, which in spite of all our care are ready at every moment to burst into pieces and to crush in their ruins the unfortunate possessor. Now that's pretty strong language from the father of economics, claiming that money isn't the objective. When Adam Smith asserted that possessions can crush and burst the human spirit, I think the founder of economics anticipated the hedonic treadmill long before modern psychology gave us this term. Adam Smith never put it this way, but he would not have denied the possible reality of Psalm 4:7. Thou hast put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. And if one of my students wonders, how can that be? The psalmist responds with a mystery more profound than the invisible hand. In your presence, there's fullness of joy. That is, in God's presence, there is fullness of joy, not in Christmas presents or birthday presents or other forms of wealth, earned or unearned. This is where the teachings of economics and the doctrines of Scripture intersect. They do not conflict. I actually visualize them as intersecting, if I dare say so, almost like a cross. Now, when I was a student at Kalamazoo College, one lesson I never forgot was taught to me in my speech class by Mrs. Nelda Balch. She told me that whenever I gave a speech, I should let the audience know when I was getting near the end. And I asked her why, and she replied, I was called Kenny in those days, Kenny, if you let them know you're close to finishing, it will revive hope among your audience. So I'm going to inform you now that I'm close to a closing. But I'm going to take a different twist here. Because I'm a Christian and an economist, from time to time, I'm invited to conferences on religion and economics. Now, there are other Christian economists like Seth Norton and John Lunn, P.J. Hill, Ed Noel, Dave Richardson, and others who have labored in this vineyard much more than I have. And they're better scholars than I am about this academic interface. But it can be a challenging interface, and it can be discouraging. So what I'm about to say may seem like whining, but that's not my reason for saying it. When economists go to these conferences on economics and religion, we're expected to know the Bible. We're expected to know some theology in order to have a place at the table. We're supposed to know the difference between Barth and Foucault, between Weber and Rorty, between Milbank and Sider. But the theologians and the religion professors generally do not think it's incumbent upon them to have taken a tough course in price theory or international trade or econometrics. to be a part of the dialogue with economists. Now, maybe this is just one of life's many injustices. Not long ago, I had surgery, and some people might call it minor surgery, but to my mind, minor surgery is defined as the surgery other people have. And I would not have trusted the surgery to someone who hadn't studied very carefully how to do this particular operation. And not everyone thinks they know how to do surgery, but most everyone thinks they know how the economy works. And they know how it works without any careful study. Maybe they know how it works, but I'm from Missouri on this. The only people I know who think economics is really hard, really difficult, are economists. Everyone else is very quick to do economics. And I think another impediment for an economist trying to work at the interface of religion and economics is that theologians and religion professors are better with words than economists are. And I'm going to give you an illustration from something that was written on the campus of Calvin College. And this is by James A.K. Smith, or Jamie Smith. I know Jamie a bit. He edited a book authored by Daniel Bell, a seminary professor, and the book is entitled The Economy of Desire. And in this book, Professor Bell obviously can restrain his enthusiasm for economics as a discipline and for the market system as a method of resource allocation. And it's purportedly because of their shortcomings from a religious perspective. And I'm going to read one sentence that Jamie Smith wrote criticizing evangelical Christians for being upset about Roe v. Wade, and for being upset about the hookup culture, and for being upset about New Age religions. And this is what Smith wrote. By locating the challenges of Christian discipleship in arcane cults, or sexual temptation, or the secularizing forces of the Supreme Court, evangelicalism tends to miss the fact that the great tempter of our age is Walmart. Now let me say that again. Evangelical Christians are criticized for being upset about Roe v. Wade, the sexualization of our culture, for worrying about New Age religions, when the great tempter of our age is Walmart. Now that's great writing as polemics, but it's wrong. It's bad economics, and therefore it's bad theology. It left me wondering, have Smith and Bell ever shopped at Walmart and witnessed the number of people of modest income who are able to buy goods like clothing for their kids and microwave ovens for their kitchens and soup and bread and dog food at attractive prices because this firm adopted a business model of operating at razor-thin margins? I work a lot with lawyers in both my research and my consulting, and lawyers have a term called full disclosure, so this is full disclosure. I've done antitrust consulting for the National Football League and for Walmart. And it's very fascinating for a kid. I was born on a farm in Coopersville, Michigan. It's really interesting to visit the home office of the NFL on Park Avenue in New York and the home office of Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas. You've heard the expression, as different as night and day? That's how different the home offices of these two organizations are. And my casual observation is that the NFL lures more families from going to church than Walmart does. When you go into most major cities in the country today, what is it that has replaced the cathedrals that used to mark the skylines? It's the massive sports stadium, usually publicly funded. I've never seen a critic of the market system take on professional sports. So far as I can tell, critics of the market system, like Jamie Smith and Daniel Bell, believe that market allocation somehow causes a mentality that is anti-Christian. So let me quote Bell. The habits we learn as consumers carry over to other dimensions of life. Think, for instance, of the commonplace practice of church shopping. That is to say, capitalism encourages a shallow, decontextualized engagement with religious beliefs. In a consumer culture, beliefs tend to become free-floating cultural objects. Okay, Bell is not as good a writer as Smith, but we get the point. Capitalism purportedly encourages or causes shallow religious experiences like church shopping. Now, one of the traits of being an economist, unlike people in theology and religion, is we don't get to criticize some economic institution without explaining what a better alternative would be. So someone trained in economics would ask Professor Bell, what's the alternative to church shopping? A state-subsidized church, as in Western Europe, where people don't church shop, they simply don't go to church. A centrally planned economy, such as Cuba, where attending church for many is not allowed. Or a simple and obvious system of natural liberty, where people go to a place of worship if they choose to do so. And just as Walmart can't survive without attracting customers to its stores, churches have to make the gospel compelling, or no one will attend. I'm sure there are other options, but between these three, I'll go for the third. It may be that the market system generates a culture, a mindset, a way of thinking that is discouraging, even hostile to the Christian faith. And as an economist, I'm open to that hypothesis. But as an economist, I recognize that to make this allegation may confuse endogenous and exogenous variables. That is, it may have cause and effect backwards. I am not persuaded that the market system makes people more materialistic. If that's true, I suppose this might buttress a perverse case for central planning. That is, we replace Adam Smith's obvious and simple system of natural liberty with a system that reduces the wealth of nations so that people will turn to God. In other words, we would favor an economic system inhabited by retailers who charge high prices instead of low prices, so that goods would be more expensive, so people could not afford to consume as much, and without the distraction of inexpensive clothing for their kids, microwave ovens for their kitchens, and other goods that they used to be able to afford, they would instead turn to God. If this is the argument, and it may well be, then in my lifetime, my time in the academy, my time on the faculty at the University of Virginia, I have witnessed one of the most profound reversals that one could imagine. From critics of the market system objecting to market allocation because it produced too little, to where the market system is criticized because it produces too much. Economics is a very important subject, but it's not nearly as important as the subject of religion. And as a result, those who teach and do research in religion, the Jamie Smiths and Daniel Bells of the world, are working on such fundamental issues that they should not get a pass when they do economics. Economics is a discipline not above criticism, and the market system as a generator of goods and services is not without what economists call market failure. Every student of mine, all 45,000 of them, have learned about market failure, or at least I've attempted to teach them about it. But to criticize the market system because it makes a false god out of consumption is a step too far. The false gods of avarice and greed were around long before the structures of modern capitalism took root, long before Adam Smith could make his inquiry into the causes of the wealth of nations. We need go no further than the book of the Bible that teaches us there really is nothing new under the sun. Many years before Adam Smith, the writer of Ecclesiastes, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, taught this: whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. That's the heart of the problem. And no pun intended, it is a problem of the heart, not a problem of economic systems. And that problem of the heart will not be remedied by government or by markets. That remedy is found in the gospel and in the ministry of the church. And, if I may say so, at institutions like Wheaton College that remain unashamed of the transforming power not of political or economic institutions, but of the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I'm honored to be here. I was told that there may be time for questions, and if that's the case, I welcome friendly questions and I welcome hostile questions.
Thank you, Dr. Elzinga. If you have any questions, please write them down on the 3x5 card, and there'll be some folks in the aisles that'll pick them up, bring them up to me. During the interval here, I'm wondering if you can answer this question. Was the sharing of property described in the book of Acts collectivism, communism, or something else? And should we emulate them?
Sure. Everybody can hear the question, I assume. This comes up a great deal. You know, one of the things that happens when you teach at the University of Virginia is a lot of the Christians you meet are new Christians. And that's a whole different culture than teaching at Wheaton College, where many of the students who come have been in church families. They've been raised learning the Bible. And for a new Christian who is reading the Bible for the first time and maybe is an econ major, the book of Acts comes along. So, well, what is this? I think the striking thing about the book of Acts that makes the sharing different from communism or central planning is that it was voluntary. And that's commended by Scripture, and it's commended to us today, the sharing of our possessions, the acts of generosity. But there was nothing state-mandated about it, and there's nothing inconsistent with the ability to do that in the context of a market system. Markets are voluntary operations. That's why Smith called it a system of natural liberty. And the system of natural liberty allows people to be generous. It's the gospel that calls them to that. It's not the economics itself. Economic science doesn't call people to something, but the system that Smith commended not only generated wealth that could be shared, but in conjunction with the gospel gives you a mandate for sharing it.
Thank you.
May I put a footnote on that, if I might, because there's a person in the audience. I mentioned the influence that this college has had on me. There's a person in the audience. When I became a Christian in graduate school, so joining the faculty at UVA was my first job where I had an income. And it really didn't occur to me at the time that the Lord had a claim on that income, that I was to share it with others. And a person who spent a number of years on the faculty here at Wheaton College. I was in a Bible study with Jim Mann and another professor, and they began to teach me about tithing and sharing with my this first job that I ever had, first real job, that this was not my income, but it was mine to share. And the book of Acts gives you that dimension of sharing. But the thing that I appreciated about Jim Mann in teaching me about this is the gentle way in which he provoked my heart to want to be a cheerful giver. I can still remember quarreling with him over this because, I'm Dutch, I'm an economist. Giving didn't come easily to me. And I remember quarreling with Jim about this, and I remember a verse that I encountered that I thought was pretty good ammunition about how the Lord loves a cheerful giver. And I said, well, Jim, I can't give cheerfully yet, so I think I should hold off. And he said, no, it's in the process of giving that you can learn to be a cheerful giver. And he was right on that. I think I have the gift of giving now, and it came out of Jim's teaching me about obedience and my heart coming along later.
Ready for the next question?
I am ready, sir.
Can't any economic theory enable a society to thrive when done from a godly perspective?
So the question is, can't any economic theory enable a society to thrive when done from a godly perspective? In one sense, yes. The question is a tautology. If it's done from a godly perspective and God desires flourishing and shalom, that will happen. The question is, what's the economic theory? If the economic theory is a Marxist theory, then I don't see how a Marxist theory of economics, which is premised on an economic view of man, that this is going to lead to thriving or flourishing from a godly perspective. Very hard for me to imagine a theory that is so stridently and openly secular. Oddly enough, most economists do not, vast majority of economists are not Marxist. And it's a curious thing to think about that, because Marx offers the one social theory that is thoroughly economic. but most people in my profession reject it. And we reject it in part because we believe human life is so much more than just economics. It's that, but it's much more.
Why did Jesus seem to say so little about economic systems?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. I agree with the premise of the question that Jesus said very little about economic systems as a system. He didn't say much about political systems either. But he had an extraordinary amount of things to say about money. I can't remember the numbers, or maybe people here, but I remember people telling me they've looked in a concordance, or they did the mind-numbing exercise. Maybe you can do it by a computer now, just how many sayings of Jesus pertain to money. There are more sayings from Jesus about money than there are about prayer. We know Jesus thought that prayer was important. From the standpoint of a numerical count, he thought money was tremendously important. It's very encouraging to me as an economist of how much he talked about the use of money, but much of it was in the context of not so much an economic system that generated wealth, that generated goods and services, but of what we did with it afterwards. That to me is when I speak to students at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Virginia, every year they ask me to come and speak to them. And it's very interesting. They almost always ask me to give the same talk. And it's about stewardship and giving. And these are people for whom the present value of their lifetime earning stream is in the millions of dollars. And what I say to them at the Darden Christian Fellowship is, to you, much has been given, much is required, and that much may be in the form of giving. And one of the interesting things that I challenge them with is the concept of the tithe, not as a minimum, not as a biblical mandate, but as a principle. And some of them will think, well, wait a minute, I'm going to be making $300,000 a year in a couple years. That would mean giving away $30,000. I'd say, yeah, that's what it may mean. And the oddity is that until people really get their hearts right on giving, they will think, and I'm picking on Darden School students here, it may be true at the Kellogg School, it may be true at the Booth School, they will think that it is easier for a plumber in Charlottesville making $50,000 a year to tithe than it would be for them to tithe making $300,000 a year, because the number is so large for them. I say, you really need to wrestle with this topic. You really need to wrestle with the economics of stewardship, because the Christian gospel comes along and asks us to do something pretty radical with our possessions, and that is to think that even though we have legal title to them, they belong to someone else. And that's where capitalism, I think, gets a little mixed up in thinking about the gospel. Capitalism, we know markets work best when property rights are clearly delineated and rights and assets can be exchanged, because exchange is so much a part of the wealth creation process. And so we place a great emphasis on the ownership of property. And the evil one comes along and deceives us and thinks, oh, well, that's your property because you have a legal claim to it. And the gospel comes along and says, wait a minute, it's really God's. And so you need to think about what God would have you do with what you have a legal title to. And to me, that's the great challenge of living as a Christian in a market economy with the staggering levels of per capita income that we observe here, is to get our hearts around the idea that while we have legal title to it, the lawyers will tell us these are our property rights, they ultimately belong to the Lord.
What is the proper role of government regulation in economies?
The fundamental role of government regulation in an economy is to think hard about what it means for the government to do justice. So it's to protect liberty, it's to protect property, and it's to provide for what economists call public goods. Most economists believe that certain goods that have a public goods character to them would be a system of courts and justice, the national defense, possibly the coining of currency. And once you get beyond that, then you get into other areas that become more disputatious. The primary one today is the proper role of the government in determining the income distribution. And economists quarrel over that. There is no unanimity among economists as to whether that is a necessary or proper role of government. Probably most economists think that the government has a legitimate role in changing the distribution of income that a market system generates. Other people would say no. I know Christian economists who are of very different views on that. Some would say it's the role of the government and say, no, it's the role of the church. If you want income redistributed, it's the role of the church to persuade people that the poor are to be cared for not by coercion, but by voluntary gifts.
Do you think business for profit is the ideal way to help people, or is the nonprofit model better?
So is business the ideal way to help people, or is the nonprofit model better? Let me answer that question first with what may seem like a pedantic footnote. So I know what the word nonprofit means. I'm on the board of 4 nonprofit organizations. But for most of us in economics, if we're really careful with language, we don't use the word nonprofit sector. We use the word non-tax sector. And it's useful to bear that in mind. Now, obviously, some people won't know what you're talking about when you say non-tax because the word nonprofit has so much captured the vocabulary of the times. But if you come at the world from an economic standpoint, and that's not the only way to come at the world, but it's a legitimate way, then you have a rational actor model about how humans behave. And the rational actor model applies to people whether they are in the nonprofit sector or whether they're in the private for-profit sector. That is, we model people the same way. So what's really distinctive about the nonprofit sector is it's not taxed. And so when students come to me and they want to work in the nonprofit sector, I will often tease them a bit and say, oh, you mean the non-tax sector. And it's no surprise to economists that people in the nonprofit sector usually support high taxes on business. It's because they're not taxed. They're in the non-tax sector. So that also fits the rational actor model when we think about people in the non-tax versus the private sector. Now, having said that, does good come out of the non-tax sector? Of course. Enormous amount of what helps human flourishing comes out of the non-tax sector. Wheaton College, I indicated my debt to this school because of people who went here who have ministered to me in profound ways. I'm a different person because of people who went to this school and influenced my Christian life. Churches, many charitable organizations that are non-tax, they do a world of good. If there's a theme to my point here, it's to set a balance that the private sector also does an enormous amount of good. That my student who comes to me and says, you know, I can't imagine working in my family business because I want to help people, she has a fundamental misunderstanding of what her father does. The world would be a worse place if nobody went into business and sold toilets and sinks. We use them every day. They're pretty important things. And it's the private sector that, for the most part, sees to it that we have PVC pipe and toilets and sinks and many other things that we enjoy. And economists tend to think, well, how did we lose the idea that type of enterprise, and I'll use that word in its double sense, that type of enterprise is somehow devalued, it's not helping people, and people who work in the nonprofit sector are almost invariably helping people. To an economist, that's not the distinction. There are nonprofit organizations that do a great deal of damage to human flourishing, and there are nonprofit organizations that do. There are private for-profit organizations that are disastrous for human flourishing, and there are those that are extremely beneficial. So the dividing line is not, as the student who walked into my office seemed to think, between the nonprofit sector and the profit sector. The dividing line is something very different, and that is who's using resources in a way that causes human flourishing. And we find that in the private sector, the taxed sector, if you will, and we find it in the non-tax sector. I rejoice when students of mine go on Young Life staff. I can't wait to get my checkbook out and support a student of mine who wants to go on Young Life staff. My wife became a Christian through Young Life. We are just greatly enthused about it. It is in, you would call it the nonprofit sector. I think of Young Life as being in the non-tax sector. I'm grateful it's there, but I'm grateful that often I go to the private sector or the tax sector and I buy things that cause human flourishing through that interaction just as much. I don't see a moral high ground with either sector.
Sometimes the market places a high value on things we as Christians don't value, such as drugs or prostitution. How do we identify and deal with products whose market value does not reflect God's value?
Sure. The short answer is we don't shop there. First of all, I mean, that's an option in a market economy that might not be an option in a planned economy. In a planned economy, there are many examples of people who have to engage in commercial activity that they don't want to because it's part of the plan. It's part of the central apparatus. So for number one, the market generates many things that many people in this room and for this institution would find to be repugnant or distasteful or contrary to God's will. The great thing about a market system is we don't have to shop there. The other great thing about a market system is that, at least in a free society, we're able to encourage other people not to shop there. We're able to tell them through the church, through other institutions, to warn them about the consequences of shopping in this area. I think I'll stop there. It's voluntary, sure. And I think other point I want to make, David, and to the audience, is that it is not the market system that causes the drugs or the prostitution or whatever market it is that we might find distasteful as followers of Jesus. It's the human heart that creates the demand for that. It's the human heart. And how do you change the heart? Well, it's the gospel. And what's the main institution we look to change the heart? It's not, to my mind, it's not the government. It's the church. It's the church.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question. In keeping with Wheaton's global perspective, where do you see China in 20 or 30 years?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, and I put it in the context of one of the real sea changes that I've had happen in my career at the University of Virginia is the amount of time I spend with students from China. I was speaking to a group of administrators at the university. This large course that I teach in the fall is often seen as a kind of a bellwether of what's going on with first and second year students because 1,000 of the first and second year students are in that class. And probably 40% of my office hours now are spent with students from China. They are very intensive users of my office hours. Many of them, you go back a generation, and the students who came to UVA from China all wanted to be, I'm generalizing a little bit, they all wanted to be engineers. Now they all want to be investment bankers. Very interesting sea change. Their interest is business and not engineering anymore. And they're very talented and very driven. Many of them are double majors in mathematics and economics, and they look at me as the guy who they hope will get them into Goldman Sachs or Credit Suisse or something like that. I'm generalizing a bit, but it's really a very profound sea change. You go back to another profound sea change. When I first started teaching Chinese students, when they went back to China, the party told them where they would work because it was a centrally planned economy. And that was just understood. You'll go back and you'll go to Chengdu and you'll be an engineer in this company, and this will be your pay. And now they all understand that they have options because they enter into a labor market that's essentially capitalistic, and the Communist Party doesn't control as much. So the Chinese economy, as it takes a hold of Western technology, Western education, and combines it with the work ethic, just the incredible work ethic of many of these students, will continue to be a juggernaut. On the other hand, I believe there's a deep fissure within the economy itself, and it is in the area of property rights. So to really have a flourishing market economy, property rights have to be clearly delineated so that people can exchange. I know what's mine, you know what's yours, and we can benefit by a mutually advantageous transaction. Much of the property rights in land in China are very poorly defined. Many, many people are taken off land that was not theirs in the way we think of property rights, but they have just been removed from that land. They've been moved into cities or work environments that, frankly, are not ones that are conducive to human flourishing. And I believe that we might see in China in 20 or 30 years a major disruption over land reform and a chasm between the haves and the have-nots that cannot readily be resolved by democratic means that we might have in the United States. And where that will erupt or how it will, I do not know. I mentioned how economists are pessimists and optimists at the same time. One of the things I'm optimistic about with regard to China is the significant number of students that come to Christ while they're studying, at least at my university. At my church recently, 11 Chinese students were baptized and made profession of faith in Christ. Some of these I knew personally, some of them I had discipled. Hardly any of them had ever heard the gospel when they came to this country. In fact, it's quite striking. One of the perverse avenues of evangelism for Chinese students is they come to the United States and they've been told by their school system that there is a religion called Christianity. They know that. They know the term, that there's a religion called Christianity, and they're taught that it is a religion for ignorant peasants. That's what they're taught. And then they come to the United States, and their roommate's mother is a scientist, and she's a believer. Or their professor of econ is a believer. And the disconnect makes them want to know, well, what is Christianity? And they'll start reading the gospel, sometimes for the first time. And it's been remarkable to see, it's not that every student who comes to UVA becomes a Christian, but of all the different nationalities that I've had the privilege of teaching over the years, the biggest propensity of students to become believers in their time in the United States is far and away the Chinese. And so I'm wondering I don't know exactly what's happening. They give reports to me, but I hear now of professors who have become Christians in China, and they're trying to figure out what to do. A professor that I mentored for a year told me that he's back now at his university. He saw that I have a picture on my wall of Jesus washing the feet of his disciple. Very profound picture for me. It tries to model out what I'm supposed to be like as a teacher. He told me he has a picture of Jesus washing the feet of a disciple on his wall. He said, it's a bold thing. People come in and say, what is that? Why do you have that? It's risky, but people are doing that in China. So I have this idea that we can forecast and we can talk about property rights and so on, but God may have a very special place for China with what's happening with the gospel. And that, of course, there's no economic model that can predict which way the Holy Spirit's going to blow. And I'm hoping he blows just through China and just opens that land up for the gospel. That would be a thrilling thing for me.
Thank you for sharing your insight. Please join us afterward for some light refreshments in the back.